Poetic peeps and gentle persons, in-betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal. Welcome to a new episode of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. My name is Damien B. Donnelly. I get to be your host and producer on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Music, and now even YouTube. Hello and welcome to episode 7, season 9. I'm sending you greetings from County Monaghan here in Ireland. I'm not at home in Dublin at the moment. I am off having a marvellous creative time at the Tyrone Guthrie Centre, a fantastic retreat by the Anna-McCarrick Lake here in County Monaghan, where I'm working on the final edits of my novel. So fingers are crossed, it all turns out well. The novel is set on a small island in Scotland that is home to a small forest and a hungry fog. And today, as I sit here recording this, looking at the window, I am overlooking a small forest currently being devoured by a very hungry fog. So what better location could I be in? And keeping me company here at the Tyrone Guthrie Centre are 3 volumes of writing from my 3 guests on today's show. Today is a special episode dedicated to the Dark Angels poets. And on this episode, we will have our Behind the Storms conversation interspersed with their poetry. So all that's left for me to say is to make sure that you're in the vicinity of a warm mug of tea or a freshly poured brandy, some cashews, cupcakes, or perhaps just a packet of Tayto crisps. This is Eat the Storms, a poetry podcast. My name is Damien B. Donnelly, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Today, joining me for our Behind the Storms chat, I'm delighted to welcome 3 very accomplished artists, 3 contemporary poets to be precise, because it says so on the cover of their first collaborative poetry book, Dark Angels, 3 Contemporary Poets, Book 1, published by Pai Parkagariki Press. Collaboratively, they are Dark Angels, and individually they are John Simmons, its creator, Tim, Rich and Therese Kieran. Thank you all so much for joining me today on Behind the Storms to celebrate your second book now, which is called And So We Grow, not only featuring the 3 of you, but opening it up to your fellow Dark Angel writing group contributors and also to American poet Jonathan Holt. Now, before we explore the world of Dark Angels, I'm going to ask you individually just to tell me perhaps a little bit about how you each fell in love with poetry, what it was that drew you into the lines, and maybe even who it was who encouraged you to pen your own lines. So I'm going to start with Therese, if that's all right. I'll briefly give you a little bit background about our first guest. So Therese is a Belfast-based poet and a visual artist, a recipient of the Arts Council Northern Ireland Awards. Her work has appeared in places like Image Belfast, CAP, Poetry Northern Ireland, Paper Clip, Coast to Coast to Coast, The Blue Nib and The Poetry Jukebox. And she is Vice Chair of Irish Pen and has been a part of the Dark Angels since I think 2014. So Therese, for you, why poetry?
Well, Damien, thank you for inviting us onto the podcast. It's lovely to be here. But I think the first person who alerted me to poetry has to be my grandfather, who lived to the ripe old age of 96. So I have very strong memories of him. And he used to recite what he called old-time poetry. Things like, "Oh, for 1 hour of youthful joy, give back my 20th spring." And he, so that definitely, I think, had to have been key in warming my ear, if you like. Then after that, I really think I stumbled into this writing journey because I started off at a class with Ruth Carr, who's a Belfast poet based at the Crescent Art Centre in Belfast. And again, I think because she was a poet, there was lots of poetry being brought to the class. And so I think that's why kind of poetry hooked me. But then I progressed from there to joining the Dark Angels and going on their residential courses. And that's been a tremendous, I would say, a mainstay in my creative writing journey.
Wow, well, it's wonderful. As you mentioned your grandfather there, it's wonderful to sort of see the circle because he crops up in the first book.
Yes.
So you have that trajectory, you have that circle completed of, his first inspiration, and then suddenly here you are as poet mother, recalling him as you take your stand as poet. So Liz Torres, thank you so much. I need to move on to Tim, if that's okay, ask you the same question about your poetic origins. And again, just perhaps to give you a little background on Tim. So like Therese, you are a writer and a visual artist, focusing on lo-fi photography. Your words and images have appeared in places like Oscillations, Random Spectacular, The Ethereal, and your piece Landfall, a poem and 4 photographs, was exhibited at the 2022 Bloomsbury Festival. And I believe you're joining us from Hastings in England, perhaps?
Yes, I am. It's normally sunny. But there's a bit of sea fret today. But
I think we have that sort of globally. It's the very same here on the end.
Yeah. It's always beautiful. What
was, how did you get the poetic bug?
Well, I grew up surrounded by words and pictures, but in sort of kind of unusual ways. My mum ran the local newsagents. So while she was working, I would sit out back and I would read every imaginable magazine and newspaper. Woman's Own, People's Friend, The Economist, all of the newspapers. So I was always surrounded by words, and also in relation to photography and typography and print and the rest of it. And so as I grew older, writing kind of then began to come out to me in all sorts of different ways. But poetry was quite a small part of what I did. Wrote a little bit at school and at university, but it wasn't until 5 years ago I just finished ghostwriting a book for someone, and the night that I finished, I said, I need a holiday from words. I'm exhausted. Things are swimming in front of my eyes. I really just need 2 weeks of not thinking about language. And of course, at 6 o'clock the next morning, I woke wide awake with poems just surging through me. And so I had absolutely no choice in the matter. Poetry said, it's time, Tim, stop messing around. You finished the other piece. Now it's our time. So then the poems were coming, and that's where it really started for me properly, and where poetry is now, part of every single day.
But it's a wonderful blend, and I think you also see the blend. I was reading back through the first collection again, and the story, the poems that you tell are very visual. You take us on a journey, and quite often unexpected journey. They take these turns. We feel quite safe, and then suddenly, oops, no, it's going to change. But it's very visual. You paint. We see what you're describing in words, so it definitely comes across. I think the mixture of the mediums.
Yeah, thank you. I studied English literature and film, so I think for me there's always this combination of media, and I think that there's something about storytelling which weaves through a lot of my poems, absolutely, that I like there to have that narrative energy, that you're being drawn along by something. And yes, I'm sorry, there are quite a few dark twists and turns along the way, and sometimes they emerge into brightness, and sometimes into more of a fog.
Yeah, no, but that's great. But it's also, I think, again, the book, even though it's divided into 3 sections, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later on, but there's a definite sense of a journey and an interlinking between all 3 sections that works so beautifully, so eloquently. And I suppose talking about the book, we should go up and talk about the reason that you're all gathered, I believe. So if we go to focus now on John. John, you are the founder of 2 influential writing organisations, not only Dark Angels, but also 26. Your own book, Dark Angels, How Writing Increases Creativity at Work, inspired artists at work to take more of a creative approach to writing. And I guess that translated into this international program of workshops of using techniques of poetry and storytelling in the office space. Your novels include Leaves, Spanish Crossings, and The Good Messenger. I wonder, of all the ways to communicate, what was it about poetry, John, that drew you in?
Poetry, I guess, as for many of us, our first encounters with poetry go back to childhood. And so when I was at secondary school, we had, as often happens, an absolutely inspiring English teacher at school. And his name was Paddy Brown. He was Irish, although we were in North London. And for O-level, he introduced us to the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Until that point, I'd seen poetry pretty much in the way of Therese's grandfather, I guess. But, it had certain things you had to have, like rhyming couplets. And then came across Hopkins, and Hopkins was an absolute revelation to me. A poem, for example, like The Windhover, that is actually a sonnet, but it's not a sonnet as I knew sonnets before. And it had such verve and energy in the language that he was using, and it made you realize that you didn't have to stick to all that, the staid vocabulary that perhaps you'd been used to, and that you could use words in a far more playful way. Not that playful was necessarily an adjective for Hopkins, but I loved it. And in The Windhover, for example, there's that when he comes to the end of the first 8 lines, and he says, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. And it was just the revelation of being able to say the achieve of rather than the achievement. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was enough to break through in terms of poetry. And then it went on from there. I carried on reading poetry, but not actually writing very much. And then the Dark Angels courses came along. And as Tim and Therese know, we went off to lovely places where, you enjoyed nature and you enjoyed being in that particular place. And we asked people to write, giving them prompts. And a lot of the prompts were from poetry. And at the end of each of these residential weeks, we asked people to write something and read it out in public, which is quite a scary thing if you haven't done it before. And Jamie Jauncey and Stuart Delves, who co-founded it with me, we decided that we had to sort of put our money where our mouth was, or whatever. And so we wrote poetry ourselves that we read out at the end of the residential week. And that started to get me into writing poetry as well. Mm-hmm. And discovering I really loved it. And because for most of my life up to that point, I've been writing in the world of business writing, I just found it incredibly liberating for me as a business writer to break away from all the sort of the self-imposed constraints, if you like, of thinking that you have to write in a particular jargon-ridden way, because I was encouraging other people not to write in that way as well. So poetry started to take over. Well, first of all, fiction, and the novels came along, but then moving into poetry, and now it's really got me.
now you're hooked.
Yeah.
But it's extraordinary to, going back to schools and teachers, and I think you either have the English teachers, I suppose specifically, you have the English teachers who are going to read you literature and poetry and pull out the book and not dust it down and read it with all the dust and all the time over it. And then you have the other ones who are going to come in and they're going to take the same book, but they're going to dust it and they're going to polish it and shine it and open it and make it so much more inviting, maybe even like a little new scent over it, just so that we feel that it's a part of us and not this cobwebbed ancient thing. because it's how it's presented to us, I think, in the beginning, in terms of how we are then receptive to it as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're reading poets often from, centuries ago, often is where you start. And, John Donne was, I think, a big influence on me. I still love John Donne. But there you have, the Dean of St. Paul's from the 17th century, early 17th century. And what do you have in common with someone like that? Well, poetry becomes universal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It doesn't matter really when it was written. It's the connection that a poet is able to make with other readers of his or her own time, but also of future times as well. And I think that's something that you don't quite get to the same intensity with other forms of writing.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because now you've brought poetry into the workplace, as you've been talking about, and maybe we'll just sort of talk about how this all came to be. So, as I said in your introduction, you yourself work in business. You come from a world of branding. I think verbal identity was a very key word, and perhaps a word that you were very key in pushing. You're the founder of Dark Angels, as we said, and also the co-founder of 26. And on the website 26, I saw that it asked you the question of what you love most about being part of 26 community. And you said supporting writers to develop their creativity. And I think of all the gifts that we have in this community, now the gift of community is so essential, because over the past 4 years, for me, sort of as a newcomer to writing, across social media platforms, across podcasts, across journals and book launches, it's the support that I've seen that has been so key, so strong, so instrumental in the encouragement of, keep going, moving forward, try more, see a different angle. That whole sense of growth, which then appears, of course, in your second book. Your own book, as we said, Dark Angels, I assume was the kickstart to all of this. And then the Dark Angels website opens up with the question, where could a deeper relationship with words take you? So I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about that relationship and about why, I suppose, it mattered so much, not only in a work environment, but also in this sort of growing global community that you are curating? Sorry, that was a long question.
It was a good question, Damien. I mean, I was working. I was very lucky. I was working in a job that I actually liked. I'd always wanted to be a writer, and the fact that I was writing in a sort of business environment, I took as no obstacle to me being able to write as well as I possibly could. If your words are going out on the back of a food package or something, they're going to be read by people, and perhaps read by people that ordinary literature won't reach. And so, it's a challenge. So you want to make that writing as effective as possible. But at the same time, I thought all around me, I saw people who were limited by the way that writing was treated at work. It was a chore for most of them. Just get on and write that proposal or whatever it was, rather than challenging them to say, well, can we do something a bit more creative with this proposal? And so that was the attitude I took, and it's the attitude I took into Dark Angels when I set that up, and also into 26, which is a membership community for writers, and we do projects that we invite people to take part in and come up with a creative approach to a particular issue, let's say. And so when we took people away on Dark Angels courses, the sense of transformation during that course was tangible. It was wonderful to see. And after a while, we realized it was a bit of a con we were practicing on the big organizations that we were charging to send their people on our courses, because people came on our courses, they loved them, and they went back to the workplace and thought, oh, I want to get out of here. and so we probably added hundreds of people to the freelance writing community. But the good thing is that they're doing freelance writing for other organizations, improving the general state of business writing, I believe. And so that was how it came about. I started writing books to express this. And actually, the first book I wrote was called We, Me, Them and It. And it was going to be published originally. I had a wonderful client at Waterstones, the booksellers. His name was John Mitchinson. He was marketing director of Waterstones. So we did lots of wonderful creative work with Waterstones. And then John left and went into publishing. And since then, he set up Unbound and also the Backlisted podcast. But it was John who first said to me, "You must write a book and we'll publish it." He was at another publisher then. And he said to me, "This is going to be a cult book." So I said to him, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it won't sell many copies, but people will love it."
Am I right in thinking you've just had a second, it's just been reissued?
Yes, it was. It came out in a 21st anniversary edition, so that's good. It was. It sort of stood the test of time, I guess.
It has indeed. Like, congratulations on that. A 21st anniversary of the book, and now here we are talking about two new books that have just come out. So last year you had the first book, Dark Angels, the contemporary poets, inviting now Tim and Therese back into the conversation. They're still with us, by the way, listeners. On the cover, on the inner cover, I think it is, that it has about the Aleph. In the beginning, there was the Aleph rising from the mud, the beginning of the world. And though the book is divided into three sections, I definitely feel that there was a fluidity throughout all three sections. Definitely a sense of a journey that takes place, whether it's just from the realization of what happens after a certain trajectory of life is over, from child to teenager to adult to wife to mother to bag carrier, to eventually the poet mother, the beginning of the poet herself, from where all lines are traced out and then back again, and moving on through all those other lines that lead us from the pen to the page to out into the road, and these lines of movement, of invitations, of flights, these journeys that often start out, as I said, with a certain expectation that can often take severe turns, have different consequences that take us to the elsewhere, to the almost done, and then on, I guess, to what's left, to what we leave behind, the legacies, the lifeguards, the sort of senseless silent screams at one too many vigils. From where did this book come? How did you all come to collaborate and make this beauty?
Well, I have to say, Damien, it was John's idea. As many things are in 26 and in Dark Angels. John is just an amazing ideas person, but better than that, he pulls the thing together and delivers. So I think because there was so much poetry kind of circulating on the courses, and John was writing poetry himself, and so he just said, I really think, in actual fact, it was one of our members, another Dark Angel, John Dobbs, who is an Englishman who's been living in the States for most of his working life. And he said, when is there going to be a Dark Angels poetry book? And so John said, okay, you want a Dark Angels poetry book? I'll give you one. And so that's where it started. And I felt hugely privileged to be invited to contribute to that first book, as I'm sure Tim did. And then we convinced John that he should be the third person.
And just to say, so the Dark Angels, it's not just poetry. So this just happens to be a poetry book, but you write in all other genres and all other forms. It's not just poetry based, or it's not.
No.
As a collective, there, the people who have joined us along the way are writers from all genres. So not just poetry.
I was going to say it's absolutely fantastic hearing your response as a reader to the book, drawing all of those 3 sections and people and groups of poems together. It was fantastic to hear that, and the lovely nods to each of the poems as we went through. And I think one of the special things about the book for us is, of course, that you, as a poet, get to work with other poets. You know, there's the cliche of the poet alone. And of course, that is an important part of our process. For some people, it's a lot of their time. For others, it's some of their time. But actually, I think one of the things that Dark Angels does, and the process of this book did for us, is that it brings you together to share drafts early on, to help each other with running orders, with selections from the long list down to the short list. And also how that then inspires broader conversations about poetry and what poetry can be for you and for the reader. So there's a fantastic process of socializing, I suppose, in a broad sense from this, which is an aspect of poetry which doesn't always get spoken about. And then you mentioned earlier how important the community response is, feeling part of this piece and actually having people share with you, yes, their ideas and sometimes their feedback, but also just a sharing of energy, a feeling of actually we're not isolated. There is something together here, and it's a good thing to be doing. And we're all a bit strange, and we're all a little bit warped in some way, but that's what partly brings us together. And from this comes wonderful, beautiful, eloquent, questioning, strange writing that defies gravity, that actually does things that other types of writing can't. And I think that's one of the wonderful processes of working together sometimes as a group. But of course, once you produce a book, it also then creates energy around it. So there's a launch event, a reading, people write to you, you get the most extraordinary, sometimes surprising responses from people to certain poems, that it reminds them of people that they have loved, people that have died, or, you know, new children or new experiences. And, you know, it goes on to have that other life. So it's been fantastic for the 3 of us to experience the full life of a book, from John's original idea and his amazing drive to actually turn it into something, all the way through to it being out in the world.
And speaking of being out in the world, this is Tim reading his poem Lines from Book 1, Dark Angels, 3 Contemporary Poets. This is a poem that's about the wonderful, incredible, extraordinary relationship that forms between a writer and a reader, between a poet and a reader, between a poet and a listener. So this is a celebration of our craft. Lines. We can go anywhere, right? You and me on this common ground, this pale Nazca plain we approach from different hills to meet and make sense of what we think we feel. Our bodies are gripped in the shoes of the earth, but we can always rise just as dust finds warm ascent to return, like hummingbird feathers, held light in the morning air's careful child hands, falling softly towards the grace of meaning. And we can go anywhere, right? Me and you.
And John, did you have to, was there a sense of one person sort of steering the book, steering the journey as you went along, or was it an organic flow? Did one person say, like, I think this is the overriding theme, or how did it work in terms of collaborating together?
Well, I think, as Tim said, we were all in it together, and the wonderful part of the process is that we didn't have any arguments, which might make it sound a bit bland and boring, but it's absolutely true. And I think the thing with Dark Angels is the way we ran the courses was always in a very constructive, sensitive, supportive way.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't have any sort of harsh critiques of people's writing. Our approach was always, any effort is a great effort, it has to be applauded. But here we were really on a higher level with three writers who had sort of distinguished themselves in some way through the Dark Angels courses. And it was easy for me to say, oh, Tim or Therese, would you like to come into this? Because I knew the quality of their writing over many years. And I was delighted when they said yes. And then it was a case of, well, we took each other's suggestions for what we each felt should go in the volume. And then we each edited each other's poems. And by editing, it's not, I don't mean, a harsh editing process like, Raymond Carver's edit or anything like that. Therese, for example, has just edited book 3 of Dark Angels, which is a volume I've written. And she is the most brilliant, creative, sensitive editor. But it comes from just questioning each individual word. Every word matters. And not just the words, but the order, the structure, where you break the lines, how you continue from one section to another. All these things are needing to be taken into consideration by the poet. And you might think, that's just a tweak. It is a tweak, but it is an absolutely vital aspect of the writing process. And I think we all benefited from this kind of editing process that we brought to the first edition, then we carried it into And So We Grow, that was the second one. And Tim in particular worked closely with Jonathan Holt, our American writer. And Therese and I were almost watching from the sidelines as that was going on, but watching with some admiration as we could see it developing.
I get a sense that to a degree, because you're in a writing group, because you've known each other for so long, you already have, I suppose, a shorthand, to each other's styles. The first book is so, as I said, it has its fluidity, it has its connections, but each voice stands out individually as well. It's not a blending of the voices. Each one is individual, but you have a theme that runs through it. And so we're talking about the second one, which has just come out, And So We Grow, taking its inspirations from the theme of Bloomsbury 2023. The three of you are thankfully still there. You welcome some of your fellow Dark Angel writers into the fold, and as we said, along with Jonathan Holt. Again, it's broken down into sections. This time it's 3 sections, very complementary to each other. The opening section, with its 15 centenas, all stemmed from botanical inspirations. Yet, even though each poem has to be 100 words, has to start with the same 3 words, end with the same 3 words, there isn't a single sense of restriction in any of them. They are as fluid, I think, as their inspirations. The second section then explores the word grow and all its possible connotations, from planting in gardens to bodies lengthening, to cracks appearing, to longer mornings thanks to darker nights, and then back to shrubs sown in gardens for absent souls. And then we meet Jonathan in the end, in the final section, whose work then kind of reflects back, very complementary to the work that we've just explored, and then expands even further. I was intrigued by all of his titles that almost become journeys in themselves. The plant that hasn't dropped her leaves, outliving your houses, resting, burning, grandmothering myself, opening up and out into the woods. And then I think I was drawn to one stanza in particular, and I'm going to slightly paraphrase, but it's tempting to keep sliding down Silverstone highways when really we should be talking about time's wizened lips clenched. We are people raised to believe time is short, and it isn't, it's wide. Tell us about this new growth, this expanding of Dark Angels and this new outing.
When John suggested the first book, he said, I'd like this to be a series, and then it came to the second one, and I think we had so many good projects on the go that it seemed natural that we should not just duplicate the number one, but that we should play around with the format a bit. So we kept the 3 sections, but yes, we got more of those voices that were involved in, the 26 project and the Dark Angels who'd responded to the Bloomsbury theme of Grow. But we knew that Jonathan Holt had probably a small archive of work that deserved an audience, and so we were very glad when he decided that he would join us.
And now I'm delighted to say Jonathan Holt is going to join us to share 2 poems. The first one is from the 2nd volume of writing from the Dark Angels poets, And So We Grow.
It's a pleasure to be part of the podcast. I don't consider myself to be a particularly political writer, but as I sit here in the late stages of what has been a harrowing political season in the United States, where I live, I'd like to read a couple of nature poems of mine that speak to that mindset. The first one is included in the book And So We Grow, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. In fact, about as self-explanatory as any poem can be. It's called Grandmothering Myself. The smallest flower is a thought, wrote someone whose words you probably never saw. You liked books, but were happiest reading the land. You didn't need a writer to tell you that the lady slipper in a jar on your windowsill was more than the sum of its petals. Look down here, you said once, under the dead leaves. Aren't they pretty? The assignment was to bring something found into class, and look what we'd found, tiny woodland flowers. In this way, you taught me to notice exquisite things that others might miss. 5 decades later, I sometimes go outside and read the land when I need to feel better. And boy, does it help. Secondly, a newer poem that grew out of several years of trying to rid the land around my home here in North Carolina of a certain foreign and invasive plant. That kind of up-close enmity can eventually morph into a type of respect bordering on affection. Anyway, this past springtime, with political clouds forming and the weed sprouting as usual, I found myself hunched over for the annual task, realizing that these little plants seemed to have something to say about resilience that I needed to hear. So this is written from the point of view of that plant. Uprisings. Precarious I rest, half dead in fungal equivalents, amidst worms' stifled yawns like unheard howls. There are no certainties. So what if the density shifts and the skin on my shriveled extremities sponges the moistures and melts into mud? This has happened before. I have no choice. It begins almost without a beginning, the seeping fluid rush of streaks engorging all at one with the within of me, old cells tumbling under untold growth. Then a tip of me crusts the dust and is in. Unfurl quick to protect the tenderest parts. That's what I've brought here from past newness, my vulnerability being a proof of existence, though that's hardly all that I am. I'm not alone is what I mean. There are millions of me, far too many in our blending in ubiquity for all of us, especially our smallest, to be mowed down or undone by fear. Our promise is that whatever the weathers and changing winds, we'll do what we do in the beginnings and scatter seeds.
For me, it was great to step into another role, a sort of growth in itself, to become an editor, co-editor with John and Tim, and to agree the kind of the shape of it and see it, help shepherd it out into the world. Because there's writing and submitting your piece, and then you forget about it and you leave it to other people to actually put a publication together, make sure it's well printed, well produced. And I have to say that John was brilliant dealing with Matt at Kakariki Press, because it's a beautiful letterpress publication setup, but it needs a little bit of what should I say, assistance, to just make sure it's completed in time. So I found it, I just find the more you do, the editing of John's book was another growth period for me. So I would say to people, if you're asked to do something that you've not a lot of experience in, just do it. Do it, because you will learn something about yourself.
Yeah, so suddenly you're put on the other side, suddenly, you send off, so as a writer, we send off so many submissions. And as you said, if we get selected, that's grand, and we wait till it comes out. But then when you're on the other side, I'm just finished now putting together the issue 4 of the Storms Journal. And there are 93 contributors. I've tried my best to make sure that the one before and the one that follows after has some kind of arc, there's some kind of flow, And I think very often it's not that we're thinking about that. We think, oh, but this is an anthology. And it's no, like there are people behind it thinking what's going to work next to this and then after and before. And it does give you a huge insight, as you said, into the other side, and even figuring out other people's styles.
And speaking of other people's styles, let's hear 2 poems now from John. And these poems come from their second volume of writing, And So We Grow. And a reminder that all 3 volumes are available from Kakariki Press.
2 poems by John Simmons. Planting time. Last week, I planted some words here, right here, in this very notebook. When I came back, I thought they would have grown. But no, the words had shriveled away to nothing. Nothing to do but plant some more here. Taking my pencil, I made the space, then dropped words like seeds in earth. Now look, just a week later, they've grown to something. Something can come of nothing. Second poem. Almost fully grown. Grew up, my inner doctor spat at me. Harsh, you might think. Tough love, actually. You see, I'd wanted to complain about pain. Won't someone help? Come take away this ache. That ache, my inner doctor pointed out, is simply what we call a growing pain. Just, you're not alone, a sign of being grown. A book chaptered in ages, now near its last pages. There's a comfort in that, strange as it seems. Learning to see our life for what it is, coming to know, yes, you can still grow, longing to be heard to the very last word.
Tim, I know that you were then the sort of close contact with Jonathan through the second book.
It's an extraordinary process working very closely with another poet on something so precious. And I think it raises all sorts of questions for you as a writer. And I think you learn so much about your own writing through that process of working with them. And there's a sort of combination between being bold in asking the big questions about the poem, while also being, I don't quite know the word, tender towards the way in which they've done it. They're caring for the way in which they've done it. It's not your poem, but you're giving them something very important, and you need to be really honest. And I've done a lot of editing with lots of different writers, but not so much with poets. And I would love to do some more, partly for selfish reasons, because I think your own understanding about words and form and the craft of poetry develops in all sorts of ways that's quite difficult to do when you're only editing your own piece. But I think also this is back to the idea of, as well as working on your own, those precious moments with the door closed, also the socialization of your drafts, about sharing them with the right people in the right way at the right time to get that kind of feedback. And as John said, sometimes just a small comment can really turn a piece, or can just open all the windows on the piece and let the air and the light into it. And you're helping that other poet to get to what the poem really could be, should be, in their way. And you're just saying, what if, or how about, or I didn't feel this about this, but I felt this about this, and giving them that energy and observation. So I think even if you're not working on a book or a magazine or a blog or whatever, I would say draw together some poets whose work you love, enjoy, or are surprised by, or are challenged by, people that you trust, and bring that editing process into a small group and see what comes from it. If you're not doing that already, I think it's a really, really valuable process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking about sort of, being parents of poems, in the same way as being parents of kids, where I say I'm not a parent, but I'm imagining if I was a parent, there are certain key lessons that I can give them in life and learning, but we send them off to school, and we entrust the teachers then to do their part. And in turn, we have a meeting with the teachers, so the teachers can tell us about how our children are out in society, in the same way that, by sharing our poems and we get the response back, we figure out what happens when the poem leaves the nest and it's owned then by somebody else entirely.
Yes. There's one little technique that I found really useful. It was introduced to me by another Dark Angels person who Therese and John know well, Neil Baker. And he and I share poems often. And sometimes what Neil does is he leaves me a WhatsApp message where he reads the poem back to me, and then sends me another audio message with his responses to it, line by line. And it's slightly nerve-wracking at first, but it's actually wonderful, and it's incredibly useful hearing other people read your poems out loud.
Yeah.
And how different shades and light and rhythm and connections between words and phrases come out that you may not be hearing in your head. And then, you can take the best of it. You can adjust the pieces that maybe aren't quite working as you want. You can look for where the rhythm might have problems or there are new opportunities. It's wonderful. Yeah, it's quite a thing though when I open up WhatsApp and see the messages.
Yeah, I imagine you're scared, but it's that thing, a poem doesn't necessarily, we pen a poem on the page, but it doesn't live its entire life on the page. And even if somebody is reading it from the page, they're reading it in their head, and it's whatever mood they're in, or maybe they've had a fight, maybe they've just made love. What they're hearing, how they read it is very different.
And now I'm very pleased to say Therese is going to read 3 poems from the second volume, And So We Grow, followed by Tim reading 2 poems from the same volume.
Late bloomers. The tulips should have gone in months ago. Instead, the bulbs were bedded in March, and who knew how they'd do. But after a week of sun, they're like chicks in the nest, open-mouthed and famished, guzzling down fat drops of rain, gobbling up hot rays and misty spray, their strong necks stretched, about to flower. Conveyor belt. Soon, all the silver-haired women in M&S will be my mother. One day, every man topped shock white and tapping a stick on the ground will be the sound of my father, and I will resist the urge to thread an arm through theirs or help fill their shopping trolley. All in a day's work. Ideas wintering in the cool, dark night, spring forth in the morning, simmer through the long afternoon, fall into shape by evening.
House of Essences. When she opened the door to me, wet wild roses around her porch dropped perfect globes of rain onto my head. Slowly, she smiled. "Hello, you're here, at last." And so I felt the ghosts of sage, musk, myrrh drift past into the forget-me-not garden, leaving us there, eyes to eyes, as a low sun softened the walls inside her hallway. All those mirrors looking at mirrors of themselves, although I recall she never much liked her own reflection. Some remembered music playing then, us sitting within clouds of smouldering oud, like breath from the oldest stag to walk the forest. "Hello. Yes, I'm here, at last." And those were the final words of the day. Everything else between us was the fermented milk of the wild. This poem is called Collecting. I see our mended jug is home to this burnt orange cosmos, wind-bent at its stem. I love how you lift up these offcuts we find just by the road. Your eye for everyday beauty, such a way of collecting ourselves. And again, I have filled the kettle and placed it again carefully on the hob's dark ribs, and again, outside. The theatre of earth is rising into air as day blots its last lines. So we sit in a perfect grey room with what we have chosen to keep close.
And now, to read her poem Dandelion from the second volume of Writing from Dark Angels Poets, this is Nicol.
Dandelion by Nicol. Blow me away, dig me out, Taraxacum, the pavement pirate I remain. A lion-toothed dandy, bold as a marigold, an edible ne'er-do-well invading your borders. From the ancient world to the Wild West, I'm a persistent little blighter. For a little air and sunlight, a dog's dribble of H2O, you can get your kicks from my free green vits. Come, my sweet butterfly, Sing your linnet song. Take me to bed, and you'll no scape a soaking. I'll grant your wish, a gift of time, if you make like a zephyr, float my flotilla, and blow me away.
The third book that's going to come out, John, you're the central point. I wonder if you've had any WhatsApps from Therese so far, reading the poems and giving you feedback.
Not no voice messages by WhatsApp. No. The third book is the future, but it's also the present. It's just literally as we speak. It's being going out into the world, and it's a long poem, pamphlet length poem called Berliners, and it's just it's Paikakariki Press as the other, so it's gone through the same sort of typesetting process. But the way it came about was unusual. I'd gone off to Berlin, and I'd been asked to run workshops for the German Film Academy, whose director, Catherine, had become a friend of mine. I'd worked with her when she ran Swiss films, and she got me in to run this workshop for her communications and marketing team. 10 of them, all from Germany or Eastern Europe, all speaking absolutely perfect English to an amazing extent. And I ran the workshops over 2 days. On the evening between the 2 days of workshops, Catherine and I had dinner, and we talked about Berlin. And it had struck me that as you walk through Berlin, it's just so full of history. You're just so aware of what had happened in this city in the 20th century and how that had affected the whole world. So effectively, you could tell the story or tell the history of the whole world in the 20th century just by focusing on the people and places and events of Berlin. And I came away from that session in Berlin and thought, I'll write a novel. But then I started making notes, and the notes turned into sort of snippets of lines and things that seem much more poetic, actually. So I started writing and divided it into 4 parts to follow the elements of the earth and the air and fire and water, and it allowed me, having created that framework. I believe structure is so important for poets and for writers of all kinds. Having created the structure of these 4 parts, I could drop individual lines or individual sort of verses that had been written into that framework, and it started to build. And I got quite excited by it, and I got to what I thought was the conclusion of the poem. I entered it for the Live Canon pamphlet competition. It was shortlisted, and it didn't win, but people said that was a good thing. I'm not so sure. I then had a conversation with Matt at Paikakariki Press, and he said, well, you need German expressionist artwork to go with this. And I gulped, and I thought, wow, that's good. He's going to publish it. That's not so good. I now need to find an extraordinary artist. Anyway, it was suggested to me that someone called Andre Krause would be good. I knew his work because he's had work published in The Guardian and other media like that. And I sent the work off to Andre, and he read it and said he'd love to do it. It spoke to him because he was originally from Eastern Europe, not actually from Berlin, but from Poland. And meanwhile, I'd shown it to Therese, and she was reading it, and she didn't come back with, oh, I liked it a lot, thank you. She came back with detailed notes on every line, every part of the poem. that I just found extraordinary and extraordinarily helpful and supportive as well. So the poem changed in that process, but didn't change so it would be unrecognizable from what was there before, but improved definitely. And so here we are now, thanks to two women in particular, Catherine in Germany, who I described in the dedication as eine Inspiration. My German is very bad. I have Duolingo German. But the poem happens to have lots of German phrases in it that fortunately Catherine checked and made sure that I wasn't making an idiot of myself. And then the other person I dedicated to is Therese for her extraordinary editing work. And I describe her as die bessere Handwerkerin. Excuse my terrible pronunciation. But that is effectively a translation of T.S. Eliot's description of Ezra Pound at the beginning of The Wasteland, where he describes him in Italian as il miglior fabbro. And so I think Therese had a similar relationship to the poem that Pound had to Eliot, although Pound was no doubt much nastier.
And now, just before we finish up, I'm delighted that John is going to read from Berliners, the third book from the Dark Angels poets. This time it's a standalone. It is John on his own, although he is firmly backed up by Therese and Tim. This is John Simmons reading from Berliners, currently available from Pai Kakariki Press.
She watched as from the blue-black sky a line of people flowed into Tiergarten, surfing on stars towards the column of gilded victory. Down the paths and between the branches, around the ponds and through the animals that once had been hunted here, among the ghosts of felled trees buried into potato fields. So now, with Linden restored, as if they'd never been cut away, castaway refugees swept hither and thither, arm in arm, politicians with angels, soldiers with cherubim, artists with seraphim, the chess players and the book burners, the teachers and learners and yearners, the present, past and future, the hope that is always last to die, her mother and her mother and her mother, floating on currents above the treetops, sailing on a shining river of stars down to an underground sea. So the city lives, so we all live in this city, so this city becomes the world, and so, for a while, the world stops, as if pausing for something forgotten. This is the way the world lives, the millions who have been. This is the way the world lives, the millions who wait to be.
So the collaboration continues. The growth is still expanding. We're now reaching Berlin. Do we have a date? Do we know when the third will arrive?
Yeah, the bird has arrived. The bird has arrived this week, so it will be available from now on. And so, yeah, I'm excited about it. I did a reading and a talk with Neil Baker that Tim mentioned at the Bloomsbury Festival a few days ago, and that was very well received. It achieved this very strange situation for a poet where you go along and to launch a book and to present copies of your book and ask people to buy them, and it sold out on the day. And so it's better than having no books at all.
Listen, I want to say thank you to all three of you so much for joining me today. It's your second visit. Thank you for coming back to Eat the Storms, and thank you so much for joining me for this conversation behind the storms. It has been an honour and a pleasure. It has been a joy to read the two first, and I cannot wait to read the third. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damien.
Thank you,
Thank
Damien.
you.
Thank you.
Poetic peeps and gentle persons and betweeners and nonconformers, genders all and genders equal. We've reached the end of another episode of Eat the Storms, the poetry podcast. My name is Damien B. Donnelly. I've been your host and producer, and thank you, the listeners, for tuning in today, tomorrow, next week, next year, or perhaps even yesterday on platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Breaker, Podbean, Player FM, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Castbox, Podcast Addicts, iTunes, Amazon Music, and YouTube. A huge thank you to my very special guests on today's show who have been the Dark Angels poets. They are John Simmons, Tim Rich and Therese Kieran. Along with them, they have brought their guests, Jonathan Holt and Michelle Nicol. The 3 volumes from the Dark Angels poets, Book 1, 3 Contemporary Poets, Book 2, And So We Grow, and Book 3, Berliners, are currently all available from Pi Kakariki Press. For details on all of my guests and Pi Kakariki Press, you can head on over to our website, eatthestorms.com, click on the podcast section, and there you'll find a blog post for every episode. This was episode 7, season 9, even if last week I told you that was episode 7, season 9. I got far too excited and skipped an entire episode. And so that's it for me here at the Tyrone Guthrie Centre in County Monaghan. I'll be back with you again next week, and next week, which will be the first episode in December, deep in the heart of winter, I am hoping that we can offer up a little light. Our first episode for December will be a podcast for Palestine. This will be a fundraising episode with poets and writers reading their own work or work of Palestinian writers. It is sometimes in the darkest times that we need to come together and be the brightest lights. I hope you'll be able to tune in to listen to their voices, hear their messages, their pleas, and please donate. Thank you so very much. My name is Damien B. Donnelly. You've been listening to Eat the Storms, a poetry podcast. And until next time, share as much as your light as possible with those in the dark. And of course, as always, stay bloody poetic.